Black Brawn, Captain Flint, Brain Trust, Earl Sanderson, Silver Helix, Chop Chop, Young Troll, Stopwatch, Will-O-Wisp, Turtle, and Xavier Desmond. All right, hello. Let's call this episode 3 of Card Table. Episode 3 of Card Table. I'll say it again. So last time I talked about Volume 1 in a little more detail. Like I said in that installment, maybe it's a little pedantic or a little overkill to talk about each book in an episode because it's going to take a while to get all the way up to 29, but I just sort of feel like you have to establish that foundation before getting into more detail. Although that said, like I think I said last time, anyone who's watching these, by all means comment, because I'd love to make this a really satisfying channel for people who are fans of wildcards, because I feel like in the past, podcasts or reviews or whatever, even essays that have shown up online for wildcards, the fans haven't necessarily been all that enthralled. That might even be true of the essays that I've written for Tor.com, which I've tried to make interesting and fun for both fans and non-fans alike. Based on the very few comments that each essay gets, I don't know exactly how engaging they're turning out to be. So I really would like this to be really what somebody wants, not just what I personally would want out of a Wildcards channel or Wildcards podcast or whatever you want to call this, but what other fans also would want out of a Wildcards online content like this. So absolutely do leave comments about what you think should be talked about, or what would be the best way to approach something about this very sprawling series of books. But in the meantime, I will go one at a time through the books until that seems like maybe it's getting old or not fresh or whatever. Sorry, I'm distracted by the... This is not like dribble or any kind of like disgusting stain. This is actually like sticky from the tag. Like the little tag that's peeled off. It's been through the laundry several times and it just won't come off. Oh well. Maybe I should have chosen a different shirt. Not necessarily putting my best foot forward fashion-wise here, but anyway, so on to book 2, which is called Aces High. The titles of Wildcards volumes, I implemented this with a fellow Wildcards fan, Greg. Shout out to Greg. Let's do this together at one point when my schedule makes that possible. But maybe do some co-hosting. But I was complaining to Greg that the titles don't really matter that much to the series. So it's let's get this one. Wild Cards, very big. Aces High, very small. Which is not really a bad thing because the title doesn't really mean too much. The first episode, I talked about the terminology. I'm not going to rehash the terminology every time because that gets so old. But, the aces are the ones with powers. There's aces in all of these. So it's also the name of a restaurant for aces, which actually is at the top of the Empire State Building, or not at the very top, but on the 86th floor, I think. And so it's somewhere in this photo. With the giant ape climbing the Empire State Building. Theoretically, Aces High, the restaurant, is in there somewhere. But they go to Aces High all the time in these books. In fact, there's a huge sequence in book 3 that's set in Aces High. So it might have made more sense to call 3 Aces High. So I won't belabor the point, but these titles, it's always just some card game lingo. Aces High, Joker's Wild, Down and Dirty, One-Eye Jacks. Not always specific lingo, but a lot of times it's just some phrase, high stakes. One of the other ones, Suicide Kings, Inside Straight. So it's always poker terminology, but it's usually pretty arbitrary. It doesn't necessarily give you any clue as to the content of an individual book, which I think is maybe a reason these are difficult sells sometimes. But anyway, this is volume 2, Aces High. We've got the original British edition with the great Brian Ball on the cover, with the character Jube the Walrus on the cover. Jube, that's Jube the Walrus, kind of as in Goo Goo Gajube. Uh, I Am the Walrus by the Beatles. This one is, I think, the very first version of the cover, the paperback. Um, I kind of like this one. It was pointed out to me that it's not, as a composition, maybe it's not great. It's just kind of like a bunch of things just kind of thrown onto the cover. Um, but it kind of speaks to sort of the diversity of the content, because there's a lot going on in this book, and a lot of it's kind of what's the right word? It's kind of out there in a great way, in a brilliant way. Um, but yeah, so the giant ape, the android flying around. I don't know if this is meant to be the turtle or meant to be a flying saucer or what, but there are aliens in this book. There's a giant ape a la King Kong. There is a robot, an android kind of flying around. Dr. Tachyon, another alien. A lady with wings. This is all part of the book. It seems from a distance, it sounds like pretty chaotic. There's just so much stuff in this one, but it's really brilliantly handled, really economical. This original edition comes out to just under 400 pages. Obviously, that depends on the different. Every time this is published, they might do a different number of words per page. But let's see, this version is closer to 350. This one reuses the Brian Bolland art. This is the iBooks edition. Which I kind of like this take on the logo is kind of neat. I think it kind of works to make Wild so much bigger than Cards, even though so much of the imagery comes from Cards. But seems like Wild is the more operative word probably. So kind of a cool way to do it. Listing the word editor down there. Yeah, I can kind of get behind this design. As long as I'm just going through the covers, might as well go ahead and show another one. Some similar motifs to the paperback. This is the Sci Fi Book Club exclusive or whatever, hardcover. Pretty cool. Again, the King Kong ape element is made much more prominent, and then the android flying to confront it. Once again, some flying characters. Some spaceships, so kind of the same elements that are on that original paperback. I do like that gorilla. He looks pretty pretty intense there. That almost looks like right out of King Kong, doesn't it? Like it almost could have been like from a still. So I guess the only thing working against this one is that someone could potentially see this and say, well, it looks like it's just King Kong, but with people who can fly. But there's more to it than that. I think I mentioned it's what books 1, 4, 8, 9, and 16 are the 5 books that the Tor editions have additional content. All the other ones are just straight ahead reprints. So there's nothing in this version that you wouldn't get from one of the other versions. But it's a cool, definitely conveys a different tone from the other ones. The other ones have the robot and the talking ape. There's another, the Bantam paperback. There's another version of the Bantam paperback that's by Tim Truman, where it's Modular Man, the android, fighting aliens, specifically the Swarm. So not too different from the content of some of these other books. So this one takes kind of a different approach. There's also the color blue seems to infuse all these other versions of book 2. I don't know if that's just a coincidence, but yeah, they're all a lot of blue in every version. There's a overarching blue motif, whereas here we get kind of a brown, tan. Even though it's water lily, and water we kind of associate with the color blue. But Michael Comark, I believe, is that how you pronounce it? Chooses a different sort of part of the book entirely, with the character of Water Lily who can control water. I mean, Comark is just such a good illustrator. I did have a friend who I was trying to sort of persuade to read these books. He kind of pointed out that this feels like a little bit more generic of a moment in the book. that's why I really kind of gravitate towards these other covers that really make it seem like some really strange stuff is going on, whether it's an anthropomorphic walrus in a Hawaiian shirt or King Kong fighting an android, whereas this one is just a normal looking lady with some water flying around. But I don't think anyone could argue against the actual quality of the illustration. I mean, it's beautiful. All the Komar covers are just so great. Are just so skillfully done. So there you go. So lots of different choices as far as which version to read. They're all the exact same content inside, so I don't know why I'm so compelled to buy editions. It's sort of like the comic book fan who needs to buy like every variant cover. Novels, they've been doing the variant cover thing for years, and it always works on me somehow. I think the iBooks version does have the iBooks version has an afterword by George R.R. Martin that is not in the other editions, and they sort of throw them all at the end. I don't know if the original idea was to have these interspersed throughout the book, but instead they just sort of throw them all at the end. There's Jude the Walrus again, the walrus in his Hawaiian shirt. Yeah, it almost seems like you would expect that these would be kind of sprinkled throughout the book instead of just tossed in at the end. But so it goes. But so this one does get you a little bit of extra content, but not story content, but some visual content that you wouldn't otherwise get, and some behind the scenes stuff from George R.R. Martin. And those are always very entertaining. He did those for the first 5 iBooks. There are Martin written afterwards, which are all available online, by the way. So you don't have to like go on eBay, scour eBay for these iBooks editions, because you can get all those afterwards from George R.R. Martin online. So Wildcards 2, what's different about it in terms of the first one? I mentioned how one of the aspects of the first one that is I think part of the appeal, as much as it might be frustrating for some readers, but I mentioned that there are a lot of stories that almost feel like pilot episodes, where Vic Milan writes the first Mark Meadows story. Mark Meadows, who will later become Captain Trips, will be his superhero name, if you like. The first Fortunato story, the first Yeoman story, and they all kind of feel like it's the pilot episode of the Yeoman show and the pilot episode of the Captain Trips show. It's the first episode of Fortunato, and you don't necessarily get any kind of catharsis at the end. It's just sort of these little vignettes, but you do get that wonderful tour through the latter half of the 20th century, where the book starts in the 1940s and ends in the 1980s, and it becomes what you may lack in closure, you sort of make up for in scope and this sort of very broad view of different points in American history, and what one of the reviews called mutant Americana, which is a quote that I always liked. I talk about that in one of the Tor essays, one of the essays I wrote for Tor.com. I mentioned that phrase, mutant Americana, because I've always liked that phrase and thought it was very evocative, very accurate for the first book. The second book, even though it's an anthology of short stories, linked by the sort of interstitial narrative that George R.R. Martin writes. It's a lot of the same authors as the first book. But it is very different from the first book, despite all that, despite the fact that it's so similarly structured and very similar list of author names. What makes this one different is partly the time scale. Rather than taking place over 40 years, it takes place over one. Starts in November of 85 and ends around summer of 86. And it's sort of almost exactly kind of what you'd expect like from a television season, in a way, starting in the fall of one year and going into the spring or summer of the next. So it's like sort of like, here's one season of Wild Cards, if you like. And it's a lot more, instead of being sort of a story than a story than a story, even though that is what this is. I mean, technically, here's a story by Zelazny, here's a story by Walter John Williams, here's a story by Walton Simons, George Martin, Melinda Snodgrass. I did forget. Um, I feel like I did Louis Schreiner a disservice last time. I sort of skipped over him. I almost did it again. There is a prologue into this one by Louis Schreiner set in 1979. So there's one brief prologue, kind of flashback, and then we fast forward to the present, what was the present at the time, which was approximately 85 to 86. So it is one story, one story, one story, etc. But it follows this. There's an overarching threat, which is the invasion of the swarm, which are these sort of alien. They almost are comparable to like the Borg in Star Trek, which I think this precedes. Yeah, it would have to. This would actually come before them, but sort of that idea that there's this sort of. Well, I wonder if the Borg did steal from this. Do you think? No. Well, or did it? I don't know. So the Borg, of course, are anyone who loves Star Trek knows Borg is in cyborg. The Swarm are different in that they're more they're made of sort of like organic material. It's described as being yeast, which doesn't sound very menacing. But the idea that there's what they call the Swarm Mother, which is kind of like the Borg Queen, now that I think about it, and then the Swarm Mother sends these sort of drones. Made out of yeast, but they're these sort of different sort of monsters from the id, sort of like spider creatures and clawed creatures and giant slugs and worms and different creatures like that, sort of swarm America and other countries. I think they said there's like 7 or 8 hits that they come to each continent and try to take over. And the various superpowered characters have to fight them off. So that said, it's not 400 pages of superhero characters fighting mindless drones. There are sort of other different entanglements. There's a group, sort of a cult. I say sort of a cult, but just a cult. The Freemasons. The Egyptian Freemasons, which obviously does exist in real life, or at least some version of it, presumably much more benign than what we see in Wildcards. But they sort of have this, through different twists and turns. I don't want to spoil every element of the plot, but through different twists and turns, this cult of Masons has foreknowledge and forewarning that the swarm was coming. That they've actually known for this cult has existed for centuries, and they've known that the swarm has been coming for centuries, because it actually has. They talk about how the swarm, this is a difference between them and the Borg, is that the swarm move very slowly across space. So they get to, the outer reaches near Pluto back in like the 1700s or something crazy. And then they just kind of are slowly making their way through the solar system. And then by the 1980s, they finally hit Earth. But anyway, so these Masons have figured out ahead of time that the swarm is coming, and so they've sort of made certain plans to capitalize on that threat. Meanwhile, the Takesians, which is the race who introduced the wildcard virus to Earth back in the 40s, they show up at kind of around the same time. I believe it's just kind of by coincidence, if I'm recalling correctly. But they sort of show up at around the same time that the swarm is orbiting, and they've come to sort of check up on the results of the experiment. So that becomes an element, and the fact that they sort of are in the vicinity at the same time as the swarm mother creates some complications. And then there's a whole sort of bit about how the swarm mother creates these mindless drones as sort of the first wave, because they're sort of like the easiest thing to create, and they sort of they're really just a sort of a test. In some cases, of all the planets that the swarm has invaded over the years, there were probably some where that first wave was all that was necessary, but in some cases, the first wave gets beaten back, but then the swarm mother kind of tries again and sort of upgrades so that the second wave is far more of a threat than the first. So there is this sort of evolution and kind of escalation of the threat, and there's various complications. But it does end up being, so you end up with a lot of the same characters from the first book. So the Sleeper, who's a character who gets different superpowers, or gets reinfected by the virus every time he falls asleep. He wakes up with a new set of powers, a new look. Um, the turtle is back, the telekinetic, who's flies around in a Volkswagen. His original appearance in the first book is set in 1963, so we get to see what life has, and he was 18 years old in 1963, so we get to see what life has dealt him now that he's 40, which is a great inverse in my opinion, or is inverse the right word? A great swerve away from the way sort of Peter Parker developed in Spider-Man, because Thomas Tudbury, the turtle, starts out as a very Peter Parker-like figure, this kind of loser who has this incredibly formidable alternate identity, even though he's such a loser in his sort of everyday life. Over the years, by the 1980s, if you were reading the comics, Peter Parker was an adult and doing pretty well, married to a supermodel, had a good job, had a lot of female admirers before he ended up with the supermodel wife. And George R.R. Martin kind of brilliantly swerves away from that with the turtle, where 22 years have gone by and he's even more of a sad sack in his real life than he was before, even though the turtle is still a very impressive sort of superheroic figure in the universe of Wildcards. So Captain Trips is back. It's about 16 years since his quote-unquote origin story. Fortunato is back. Yeoman is back. So we get to see the continuing saga of these different characters, but there's also it's all very unified, because of this the thread, the unifying thread is the swarm invasion and the Egyptian Freemasons and the Tahitians, and there are other elements. Again, I don't want to spoil everything. Jube the Walrus plays a very important part. That's really fantastic. He's the star of the interstitial narrative that sort of binds the different stories together. And probably one of the best things about the book is the Jube the Walrus stuff. The whole thing, when I read it originally, I read it in probably 1990 or 1991, and at that point, Marvel Comics had done it in 1988 and 1989, and probably some other times too. But 1988 was the first time where their annuals for the year were all like one unbroken story, where there was this underlying thread of the character of the High Evolutionary. And then in 1989, it was an invasion by the city of Atlantis, the whole Namor the Submariner mythology. And if you read the annuals in the correct order, you'd get like sort of the saga of the High Evolutionary, or the saga of the Atlantean invasion, but as it affected one group at a time. So you'd read a Spider-Man annual, then you'd move on to the X-Men. Boom, boom. So when I read Aces High, I thought, oh, this is kind of like if all these characters had an ongoing series, all these like kind of super characters had a comic book, this would almost be like their Evolutionary War or their Atlantis attacks, a mega crossover with all the annuals. And then only much later did I kind of do the math and think about the calendar and think, this came out in 87. I can sort of imagine like Mark Grunwald or someone reading it and going, hey, you know what? We could actually do this with the Marvel characters. It didn't occur to me until much later that this is probably where Marvel got that idea to do those widespread crossovers in the annuals. I mean, they had been doing stuff like Secret Wars going back a few years to like 84 or 85. But those had kind of a different structure. I guess you could argue that Secret Wars 2 kind of did it, with the Beyonder being the threat that hopped from one character to another. Maybe. I still have the notion that maybe, just maybe, that whole idea of the annuals being connected that way, there's just something about it that rings very, very similarly to how they structure this book. Originally, what George R.R. Martin explains in the afterword, for example, and in some other places, he's talked about how the swarm invasion was originally the concept for the first book in the series, It would be you'd start it in the 80s, and it would just be there'd be all these superhero characters, superhuman characters. They never really are called superheroes, but these superhuman characters, and then they have to deal with this invasion by the Swarm. And then when Howard Waldrop uh, was very firm and unyielding in wanting to set his Airboy homage about Jet Boy, wanting to set that in the 40s. Only then did George R.R. Martin decide, oh, well, then the first book should just be about getting from the 40s to the 80s, and then we'll save the Swarm for book 2. What's interesting about that to me is that there is a sense, and I do really like the first book, and I know some of the people that I've talked to about it, and some friends who have convinced to read at least a few of these books, really like that element of the first book, the fact that it is sort of this historical tour, this sort of magical mystery tour of the 20th century. And book 2 doesn't have that. It's not set up that way. But it always reads to me like when you know that this is the book they were planning to do from the start, they do feel somewhat like unleashed. The first one is this. A lot of the stories have this very careful quality to them because they're really working to evoke the different eras that the stories are set in, and that's extremely rewarding. Don't get me wrong. Walter John Williams' story about the House on American Activities Committee, persecution, and with Nixon and Rankin and all those horrible people. Evoking that, and Victor Milan's evocation of the late 60s, the Vietnam era of Vietnam, the Vietnam era of the United States, and the what he calls the Vietnam epoch, and sort of evoking the sort of rock and roll protest heavy metal, how that all was bound together, the sort of rebellious spirit in the air, and the way rock music was so influential, and sort of tied up in that whole protest movement, and the sort of hawk versus dove mentality of the time, progressives versus conservatives, and military versus hippie, if you like. Again, like so evocative and so very precise in the way they put it together. The opening story, for that matter, the Jet Boy story, is a very loving nod to maybe the actual 1940s, or arguably just our sort of sense, collective memory of the 1940s as this more innocent kind of time, more simplistic time. I guess whether what you want to argue that it actually was that simple back then, or just that it through our haze of memory seems that way. But so that's like really an important, a significant feature of that book that just kind of emerged. Just kind of fascinating that it kind of emerged by accident, just because of Howard Waldrop being apparently very obstinate, or at least that's Martin's take on it. Anyway, the second book is so different from that, because the second book is it's set in the present, so there isn't no energy, shall we say, is expended on recreating a time or an era, and it's very much more plot driven than it is. I don't know what you'd call a period piece being driven by era driven, or period driven, setting driven. But this one it's so plot heavy, and there's just it's thick with plot elements, and just there's just so many things, and the writers just seem to be bursting with all these ideas. That, like I say, this was going to be book 1, so this is all the ideas that they sort of held back for one book when Wildcards 1 became something different, and now I sort of picture them kind of chomping at the bit to, like, let's finally get to that Swarm story that we talked about, and then they do it, and it's just it's so packed with ideas, but it's also it's so well coordinated. It really is kind of George R.R. Martin. He makes it look deceptively easy. He's talked on his blog sometimes. There was a great blog entry where he talked about how and I think I might have mentioned it in one of the earlier videos about how like they see George R.R. Martin's name on these newer editions, so huge, like that, really big. Whereas the phrase wildcards is so tiny. But the way they also seem to be not hiding, shall we say, but de-emphasizing the phrase edited by, because fans are like, well, edited by, that just they act as if he's just stamping his name on something, and he kind of took umbrage of that, rightly so, on his blog one time, where he was like, editing these things is quite a lot of work, and you can almost, I mean, to his credit, it's so seamless that he really does kind of make that part of the job invisible. It's pretty impressive, because if you actually really try to think it through, like the way all these stories have to link together, it's pretty fantastic. And this one is particularly good at it, where every story is just really imaginative and really cool. I guess to go through the stories one by one, well, to finish that thought though, I think every individual story is really cool, bursting with ideas, super fun, but it also serves the whole, and it does every story does a great job of passing the narrative baton to the next story. There's a great use of a MacGuffin in this book that, it might be a misuse of the word MacGuffin, because that implies that it's, well, MacGuffin. It's a great way to sort of link the stories. There's this, the singularity shifter is the name of the MacGuffin, described as just just basically a black sphere that looks kind of like a bowling ball, and so it's colloquially often referred to by characters in the book as the bowling ball, and it sort of passes from one character to the next, where some stories are all about the bowling ball, and getting it or trying to get it. In some cases, it just kind of shows up right at the start or right at the end of a story, or and it's not in every single story, because that would be a little forced to make it that on the nose. But it one of the fun things about this book, and one of the very, I think, ingenious ways that they connect the stories, is just through something like that, like a very tangible object whose position in the story you can kind of track, like, oh, this guy stole it, but then he gave it to this guy, and then that guy sold it to somebody else or lost it, and it ended up, captured, or Turtle had it in his shell when the turtle got kidnapped, or Turtle had it in his shell when the turtle got beamed up by aliens or whatever. So now the aliens have it, but then Tachyon has to get it. And it's a lot of fun. It's there's a real sense of fun to this one. Like I say, a lot of imagination, but a lot of humor too. Definitely some absurd elements, such as the King Kong element of it. So so yeah, I guess we can go through each story one by one. I guess that's kind of what I did last time, just to give it a little bit of just to give more context, and not to be quite so general about these stories, but. So the first story, set in 1979, is the Louis Scheiner Fortunato story, which picks up on a thread from the Fortunato story in the first volume. Because like I said, that's one of the ones that feels the most incomplete, if you like, because there's this sort of central mystery about who's behind these murders. This is the book where you find out who was behind those murders. And Fortunato, at the start of the book, is still trying to figure that out. So that right away kind of is a great way to kind of pull you in. It takes one of the most deliberately loose threads of the first book, something that was very deliberately left very open, specifically because they already knew that book 2 was going to be all about that. So they hook you right in from that, right from the start, by following up on that and saying, okay, you're in. It's nice for a reader, because you feel like the writers are saying, you're in good hands. We know that we never explained that. Now we're coming back around. We're going to you're going to get your resolution. So great stuff. And then from there, you get the first Jube interstitial. Jube being a news vendor in Jokertown, who looks like an anthropomorphic walrus. um, gets very entangled in the swarm invasion and the Masonic element, the Egyptian Freemasons, through circumstances that I guess I'm loath to spoil. If anyone has looked at my my Wildcards tribute video where I did a song based on Billy Joel's "We Didn't Start the Fire," I spoiled a bunch of stuff in that. Mr. Martin himself actually was like, some of those lines. He kind of took me to task at one point for some of those lyrics being a little too spoilerific, which fair enough. I wasn't really thinking, I guess. Sorry about that, George. I didn't mean to spoil it. So I won't be too spoilery here, but George R.R. Martin writes these stories about Jude the Walrus. They're utterly fantastic. One of the best parts of the book. Segues into The Sleeper, like I said. Another really, really great comedy story. The first Sleeper story definitely had comedic elements, but it had sort of a tragic, sort of a melancholy undertone to it, and kind of a sad ending. It was a little dark. Maybe dark's the wrong word, but a melancholy ending, I would say. Had a sort of tragic feel to it, as quite a few of the early stories in the first book do. But this one, so the Sleeper comes back. He's still around, in the 80s, falling asleep, waking up with a new power. It's implied that that's just been how his life has been for the last 40 years. And he's sort of gotten used to it. In the first story, it was still something that he was kind of coming to terms with and not always dealing with well. And in this story, at least in this particular story, at this phase in his life, you can see he's at least somewhat well adjusted, at least sometimes, and ends up in this. Zelazny creates this amazing farce about how there's an alien corpse in the morgue that somebody doesn't want Dr. Tachyon to find because it belongs to. Well, this is getting down the rabbit hole too, but I already mentioned that the Swarm are in this book. There's the Egyptian Freemasons. There's the Takesians. There's also the Network, one of the awesome concepts introduced in Wildcards that is a great example of how there's just so much creative stuff in these books that, they filled 29 volumes. You sort of get the impression they already could have filled 100 volumes because there's just so much creative stuff on every page. The Network is a great example because it's like this brilliant sci-fi concept, this sort of spacefaring, I want to say empire, but it's not really an empire because it's all founded. The whole foundation of the Network is capitalism, so it's not imperial the way empire would imply, but it's just this sort of coalition, I guess, of people that are bound to the core race. I used Star Trek before for metaphors with the Borg. So the Network is kind of like the Dominion from Deep Space Nine, where you have the founders who are like the ones in charge of everything. And then you've got all these other races that are sort of pledge loyalty to the founders. That's kind of how the Network is. The master traders are the analogs to the Dominion, or analogs to the founders. But the master traders, so they have all these worlds and all these races that are loyal to them. But the sort of what makes it unique, at least in my sci-fi reading, is that the loyalty is via contracts, like where they and everything has to do with economics. I just did an essay for Tor.com, and they actually asked me to cut the section that I thought made it the most relevant, which is the fact that we're kind of becoming the Network, aren't we? I mean, we've got these because the master traders are the 1% in the Network, and everyone else just kind of all the money is just flowing up to them, not trickling down but flowing up. Which is pretty much what's happening in America, right? I mean, I don't think that's too controversial a thing to say, is it? I mentioned that in my essay about the network for Tor.com, and I was told, "Oh, don't talk about that. That's depressing." And I said, "Well, I mean, I didn't argue. I just deleted that section. But if anyone is interested in reading the unexpurgated, more depressing version of it, let me know." I think it's a very relevant concept, this whole idea of the network, and so they're a presence in this book. There's never actually been in 29 books. We still haven't actually seen the network kind of really forefronted as the main villains in a book. They've always been sort of either not there at all, because Wildcards isn't really about alien invasions. This book very much is, but the Wildcard series as a whole is more just about superhumans living on Earth. So a concept like the network would be very much front and center if you were writing a space opera saga. But since Wildcards is not space opera, then the network instead is just this sort of presence on the fringes of the Wildcards universe. I read at one point they were thinking of doing a trilogy of the Aces versus the network kind of thing, a network triad, and it just the momentum of the series kind of took it in a different direction, and I'm still holding out hope. They seem to have abandoned the whole triad idea, which I think is fine, but I would like to see a book where the network really are the main villains for at least one book. You know, I mean, I know originally there was talk of a triad about that. I'd be cool with that too. I just want to see them come back because I think they're such a cool concept. So the master traders. So there's one of the races. I always forget. Is it Kandiki? Sometimes I mix up the name of the characters and the name of what race they're from. But there's an alien who's a member of the Kandiki. I don't think that is, maybe that's a different whatever. One of the member races of the network. One of the members of that member race, their corpse is found, or their corpse ends up on Earth, and Dr. Tachyon, it's assumed that he's a Joker, of course, not that he's an alien, and he's taken to the Jokertown clinic so Tachyon can dissect him or whatever, autopsy him. And another network agent wants to make sure that Tachyon doesn't see that corpse, because right away he'll recognize that it's a member of a network, that he's a network operative, and that will mean that he'll know something that at the moment he doesn't know, which is that the network is interested in Earth. So this network operative hires Corey Crenson, the sleeper, to steal the corpse. Maybe more backstory than you need. The point I was trying to get to with that story was the comedy element, which is that this corpse is sort of described as looking kind of like a giant grasshopper, and he manages to successfully steal it, but then the Egyptian Freemasons are also after it, so they've hired a different ace to also kidnap the corpse, and so there's a fight over this corpse, and it's a very fragile insectile grasshopper body that keeps on getting more and more damage inflicted upon it. And there's a character called Kid Dinosaur, this little kid who can turn into different dinosaurs that are of the same mass as the kid, so they're like mini dinosaurs. So you can turn into a mini Triceratops or a mini pterodactyl. And there's a whole running bit about how when pieces break off of this alien corpse, whatever substance is in it instead of blood is incredibly unpleasant, or emits a very unpleasant odor. So the whole thing becomes a farce, with these different aces fighting over a giant grasshopper while a tiny dinosaur is floating around the fringes. And Zelazny just masterfully sort of builds it up to this sort of physical, or this sort of farce rendered in prose. Really, really good. Then we get to the Walter John Williams story, which is the story of It's called Unto the Sixth Generation. It's about Modular Man, the android character who gets a lot of cover time on a lot of these covers. You see Modular Man, although I don't. Well, I guess that one's all right because you only see him from the back. It's kind of hard to tell. A lot of times in these visions of Modular Man, they're not quite these cover images. You know, he's got this like silver face, which I don't think he's supposed to have. If I'm reading the descriptions accurately, I guess cover art isn't always quite perfect, especially on these old sci-fi books from the 80s. I get the sense that those book covers were cranked out sometimes pretty fast by artists who probably were not given any time to actually read the books. Stephen Lee, actually, or Lay. At one point, I'll find out the right way to pronounce it, but he had a great blog entry about different covers to different editions of his books that he's written, not Wildcards books, but just the different entries in his bibliography. It's a really great blog entry. I'll try to find that and maybe link to it. But it's really entertaining, just really interesting to read an author's take on the cover art for their own books, positive or negative. It's just very interesting to hear what they think about that. I actually just had a little email exchange with Ian Tregillis about his really fantastic Milkweed trilogy, the Milkweed Triptych, as it's called. Was talking to him about some of his opinions on the different cover art to different editions. I'm really fascinated by that. I always think that's a really interesting thing to hear authors talk about the covers to their own books. But anyway, not always accurate, as I think all of those authors would attest. And I think this is another example. I think Walter John Williams would be the first to tell you this is not how he envisioned Modular Man and not how he describes him. But cool idea. The idea that the wildcard virus can change people in a lot of different ways. So in some cases, the superpower that it gives you might not be strength. It might not even be telepathy. It might just be the ability to invent, and it might be the ability to invent only one thing. So in this case, this guy's managed to create artificial intelligence, but it's implied right from the start that it's his wildcard power that really has let him do that. That's given him a sort of genius beyond what any normal human living in the 1980s could possibly, just an advanced ability in robotics and computer programming that just would not be possible at the time. That's still 6 generations away, I guess you might say, hence the title. But super cool idea. So then you get this sort of really badass android character who's one of the some of these concepts in Wildcards I think are more comic booky than others. And those are the ones I tend to gravitate towards, the ones I really like. I think Modular Man fits that category. Like Dr. Tachyon is this sort of like foppish dandy, dresses in sort of clothing that we associate with sort of 18th century Europe or something like that, and just kind of foppish and effeminate and reading minds. Not someone you can imagine translating necessarily to, say, like a Marvel comic book, which in itself is cool. That they're not always basic, blatant comic book archetypes. But at the same time, it's cool that some of them are. So then right alongside someone like Dr. Tachyon is someone like Modular Man, who's just this like badass android, who can fly. He can turn insubstantial, so he can phase through walls, and then he can attach different modules, which are generally speaking weaponry of some sort. So he can shoulder mount different guns. Every power, almost the way you might see like a little kid describing, like if a little kid were to create like their ideal character, he'd be like, oh, and he's super good looking, and he could shoot lasers from his shoulders from these guns, and he can turn insubstantial, he can fly really fast, and he's got a computer mind, so he's super smart and can remember everything, and et cetera, et cetera. And Whereas in some cases you might be like, well, that seems like like a Mary Sue almost, where it's very, this sort of idealized like guy who can do anything. Um, but Walter John Williams is such a savvy and canny and shrewd writer, so he's using it to different purposes, taking that kind of, again, Mary Sue is so negative, but that sort of like archetype of this hardcore badass character and bringing drama from it in different ways, for example, kind of speaking to this perhaps emotional immaturity of the scientist who created him. If it's the kind of thing that a kid would create, maybe that speaks to the emotional maturity levels of Travnicek, the character who created him. That said, it's also just kind of cool because he flies around and he ends up seeing this giant ape, who's another result of the wildcard virus. Fights a giant ape, rescues the beautiful blonde girl that the giant ape has grabbed, and then starts a sexual relationship with the blonde girl, living the dream in many ways. And that's also very fun. And then he gets involved in the singularity shifter stuff that I mentioned before, the bowling ball. He's one of the first characters to kind of chase around. Again, a little bit farcical, not quite as comedic as the Zelazny take, but there's a sort of farcical element as everyone's chasing for this bowling ball. But yeah, the Modular Man stuff is great, and he's also our sort of POV character, point of view character, POV character. When that first wave of the swarm hits, of these mindless drones, we get to see a lot of Modular Man kind of taking out these horrifying creatures. Fighting alongside other aces, but so there are a lot of cool sort of superhero versus alien moments, the kind of stuff that you want to see, like the sort of visceral 12-year-old in you wants to see, like just some cool stuff, like superheroes, kicking the bleep out of aliens, but it's all from Modular Man's POV, and yeah. Incredibly entertaining, like Walter John Williams' stuff always is. Then the next story, If Looks Could Kill, Walton Simons, who was not a contributor to the first book, and again, whenever I say that, I mean like actually like a credited contributor of one of the stories. In many cases, the authors have already, before a certain wildcard author first is credited with a story in a book, it's quite possible that they've already created characters that have already shown up in a previous book. So I want to say that Walton Simons was actually a contributor right from the start. It's so whenever I say that, like, someone who a new contributor. I just mean contributing a story. Something like Gail Gerstner Miller would be a good example, because she created Peregrine, the character Peregrine, the winged woman who this sort of is. Although again, much like Modular Man, she's not really like, I don't know why she's monochromatic. For example, like she looks like she's made out of sand or maybe out of gold. I don't know. But I think that's meant to be Peregrine, this beautiful winged woman who sometimes is sort of the icon of wildcards. You'll see a lot of wildcards imagery where she's very central. And she's obviously in this book. She's mentioned in the first book. She's significant in this one and in the third one, created by Gail Gerstner Miller. And then in the fourth book, we actually get a story told from Peregrine's point of view, and that's written by Gail Gerstner Miller. So when I get to that point, I will say something like, Gail Gerstner Miller contributes to wildcards for the first time in book 4. Again, I just mean contributes a credited story, because obviously she had already contributed well before book 4. So I think Walton Simons is probably another example of that. So this is his first time contributing a credited prose story to wildcards, introducing his character Demise, a villain. I guess it's still probably more common that the good guys are the POV characters in Wildcards. But one of the interesting things about Wildcards is we do get some stories told from the POV of the bad guy, of the villain. We see that in the first volume with the Puppet Man character, major Wildcards villain, probably like the iconic Wildcard, the quintessential Wildcards villain. We get a story from his POV in the first book, and in this one we get a story from the point of view of Demise, who is a villain who can kill you with a look. As long as he can catch your eye, even for a second, he can lock in on you and then kill you with a look. Great power for a villain. Great character. Not necessarily my favorite story in this volume, but I feel like this is sort of the Demise one. I don't feel like it. It's true. This is like the Demise origin story, which I feel like Demise really comes to life once the origin is established and we get to see him actually more in action. Then from there we get a really neat, almost like little mini trilogy of stories within the book, starting with Winter's Chill by George R.R. Martin, which is the turtle story in the book, which I kind of already alluded to. We get to see him as a 40-year-old, as a real sad sack. Very, very, well, pretty melancholy, but I just love how it's such a sort of inversion of what you might expect. Great, very emblematic of kind of what Wildcards does very often, which is sort of to take what seems like a really badass superhero idea, but then kind of invert it and make the reality of it in the books seem not as enviable as it would seem on the surface. Turtle is sort of the quintessential first version of that, where it's like, what a great power, like the most powerful telekinetic, can move anything with his mind, can throw cars around just with his mind, and you can't hurt him. He's bulletproof, not through his powers, but through his ingenuity, by building this sort of armored vehicle that he can just sit safely inside. So he's totally safe, he's armored, totally rad power, coolest superhero ever, which conceptually he really is. I always found his power very enviable and his whole situation enviable. And then of course the delightful twist is that his personal life is that he's just sort of a neurotic mess. Again, very Marvel Comics, I guess, very Peter Parker, but sort of Peter Parker squared or something, just it seems like his life is more pathetic than Peter Parker at his worst, and then that one kind of segues, Turtle gets the bowling ball, that important MacGuffin keeps moving on, and then that story kind of segues to really fantastic Melinda Snodgrass story. I guess you could argue that it's kind of like a duology, depending on how you wanted to look at it. I guess you could argue that the turtle story kind of stands on its own, and then there's this duology, what you could think of as the friends and relatives duology, because there's relative difficulties, the Melinda Snodgrass story, which segues right into With a Little Help from His Friends, which is the Vic Milan Captain Tripp story. So relative difficulties with a little help from his friends. Get it? Friends and relatives. And those stories really are a true duology, where in the first one, Tachyon has to deal with the return of his Takesian relatives to Earth, and ends up, he meets Captain Trips for the first time, and then they sort of team up, and they team up with the turtle as well, and sort of have to face this extraterrestrial threat. Incredibly entertaining story that sort of seems finished once you get done with it, and then Victor Milan writes another team up between Tachyon and Captain Trips. The first one is told more from Tachyon's perspective, although I think Captain Trips and Tachyon are both POV characters in Melinda Snodgrass's story. Yeah, and then Tachyon and Captain Trips are also both POV characters in Victor Milan's story. So it really is like two halves of a whole. And then it's sort of like a true sort of sequel, even though it's all within one book. It's like one story is kind of a sequel to the one before it, where Captain Trips and Tachyon have to team up again to once again face a twist that they didn't see coming at the end of the story before it. So, and they're both really, really good. I love the Captain Trips character. He's my favorite character in Wildcards. Victor Milano is my favorite Wildcards writer. Snodgrass also writes a great Captain Trips. The whole thing, and the two stories, for all that, when you just describe them on the surface, they're very similar. It's basically Tachyon and Captain Trips team up against the Takesians. That one sentence elevator pitch would apply to both stories, but they're both just very different in tone. But they also they complement each other very well, and they mesh really well. Even though Snodgrass and Milan their writing styles are different enough that you really get two very different stories that really play off against each other really nicely. Definitely my favorite sequence in this book, that going from the turtle story, boom, right into the Snodgrass story, boom, right into the Milan story. Really good. Really good stuff in this one, man. And then it gets into sort of what you could probably think of as like the final act of the book, where the Swarm Mother kind of comes back for round two with a more impressive set of swarmlings. And the Egyptian Masons plot kind of comes to a head as well. The first part of the first part of the last act, I guess, whatever. Kind of losing control of my metaphors and analogies here. Is it the last act? Is it the last scene? What are we looking at here? So the next story is called By Lost Ways by Pat Cadigan, who didn't contribute to the first book. Introduces a new character called Water Lily, who can control water, as you might expect. That's her on the cover. One of the earliest, female protagonists in Wildcards. There really aren't too many early on. Vagabond in the first one. Jennifer Malloy who was created by John Joseph Miller for book 3, but retrofitted into book 1 in the great Carrie Vaughn story. I think that's it in the first book. Not too many in the second book either. I think Water Lily is really really on the cutting edge there. So we get a female protagonist, which is nice, and that one sort of gives us sort of our big sort of climax as far as the Egyptian Mason thread of the book, and then that leads us into Half Past Dead, the John Joseph Miller story, which is really the big climax, which involves a team up between Yeoman and Fortunato. Yeoman being John Joseph Miller's character from the first book, who was on this sort of kind of 80s action movie kind of vendetta against a sort of super criminal kingpin called Kian. And the story kind of lampshades the fact that only two books in, Yeoman's getting a little distracted from his vendetta because all of a sudden he's teaming up with Fortunato against the Swarm. Yeah, so I think just based on my ramblings, you can kind of get a sense of how they are individual stories, but they're clearly connected. I guess it's worth mentioning that in the Yeoman story at the end, the bowling ball plays an important factor, so that MacGuffin keeps on coming. So yeah, Yeoman, Tachyon is involved in that team up as well. So a lot of overlap, more so than in the first book, although the first book did have some of that kind of overlapping of characters, but this one really has, Tachyon shows up in every story in the first book too, pretty much, but Tachyon, the turtle shows up in more than one story, Captain Trips shows up in more than one story, the Sleeper manages to make a couple appearances, Fortunato bookends, the book. There's the Fortunato story by Lou Scheider at the start, and then he teams up with Yeoman at the end. Jube the Walrus, of course, is a presence throughout. The whole thing is, I don't know exactly just how many times I can say it or how I can hit it hard enough, but it's just so impressive the way how tightly this is woven together, how each story, the way they flow together. It's also hard without without getting into some spoiler elements, because some of the elements that are so impressive in the way that they're tied together, you almost can't describe them without actually giving away the plot, or giving away certain key reveals. But I will say, so it ends. So the big showdown with the swarm, with Fortunato and Yeoman, sort of climaxes the book. But then there's one last chapter of the Jube interstitial, the Jube the Walrus interstitial at the end, which is only, here's in the original version, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 pages long. Those last 9 pages are just, I marvel. I've read the book many times, probably more times than is healthy, that any healthy adult human should read the same book over and over. But I just marvel at how with everything that's been going on, and the book is so dense with incident. But throughout it, George R.R. Martin has been sprinkling these little moments and little things where you can go back. Once you've read the ending, you can go back and see him planting the seeds. But just in those last 9 pages, the reveal and the explanation and the way all the pieces are finally assembled is so deft. It's like I say, it's frustrating in a way, because you almost can't really explain how clever it is without just giving away all those elements, which I'm loath to do. So, but it's so impressive. Those last 9 pages of the second book, chef's kiss, as they say, just so good. And it's also even literally like the last. I'll just kind of flash this. Boom. Is that? If I could, I'll just flash this real quickly. Zoom. That's the last page. Just those like 3 or 4 sentences. Even those last 4 sentences are like, zing, like Mike. It's like a literary mic drop. Just George R.R. Martin being like, and that's how you end a book. Bam. It's so cool. So it's a really good book. I think it's definitely worth. I feel like if anyone, not that anyone makes such specific requests of me or anyone probably, but if anyone was to come to me and say, "Oh, I just want to read a couple of these books. I don't want to read all 29," I'd just be like, read the first 2, because the first one has quite a few setups, and then this one just has all these slam dunks. Like, in some cases, like specifically from the volleys in the first book, particularly like with the Fortunato story, setting up the mystery of the Egyptian Freemasons and stuff. But the first book has quite a few volleys, and then this second book is just like boom, slam, boom, like, yeah, like we set up the turtle, where here's what he's like now. Like, we set up Mark Meadows, now he's Captain Trips. We set up Fortunato, had a mystery to solve, here's the mystery, and just bam. And it's almost like a perfect little. You could stop with book 2. Obviously, I don't recommend it myself, but it is kind of like a perfect little duology. The first 2 books in the series, I put away all my copies of the first book because I figured I was only going to be talking about the second one, so I can't actually hold up books 1 and 2. But I think they're a really good duology. And yeah, the second book is, even though it is an anthology of short stories, like I just described, by different authors, I mean, it is a true novel. I think it's novelistic. There's an arc to it, character arcs, thematic arcs, through lines, the MacGuffin that gets passed from story to story, right down to the ending with a masterful reveal and a great catharsis and a brilliant last line. I mean, this one to me has it all. I think it's just so good. So I see by the clock on the wall that I've been talking for an hour. My voice started to fail after like the first 10 minutes because forgive me, I sang earlier tonight. Sometimes I sang, no big deal. But so that was, let's consider that the episode all about Book 2, Aces High, Wildcards Book 2, Aces High. Next time we'll hit Book 3, Joker's Wild, which again, that title has nothing to do with the actual story content, but that's what it's called, Joker's Wild, for whatever that's worth. But we'll get to that next time, book 3. But let's once more just luxuriate in how good book 2 is. Book 2, Aces High, Wild Cards. One of those, an example of when the sequel is better than the original, in my opinion. I mean, book 1's great, but this one just blows me away. I think it's like just so wonderful, so fantastically done. I can't say enough. Can't say enough about how good it is. If anyone wants to comment about what they love about book 2, obviously comments are great. Liking and subscribing, all that stuff that you're supposed to do with YouTube. Obviously that stuff's great too if you want to do it. If you have anything negative to say about Aces High, obviously don't, because you're so objectively wrong. So why would we want to hear from you? But beyond that, yeah, please comment. And again, if there's stuff that you just want me to talk about, or want someone else to talk about it, like if your problem with the show is like, I like everything about the content except the guy in the blue shirt with the schmutz, that's valid too. So, if that's your comment, I'll take it. But yeah, I'm certainly enjoying this opportunity to really talk about the books and kind of create some online wildcards content. I want to keep doing it, hopefully. Whatever would help that outcome, and whatever would help make this the premier wildcards online content, the premier source for online wildcards content, shoot those comments my way. And see you next time on Card Table. Have any class? She says, what is it? I'm trying to visit with my pal Melinda Snodgrass. Shoot the breeze with Walter John Williams. Hang out with Howard Waldrop. I've been smarting for George R.R. Martin. His characters have so much power. I like to go out dancing. My baby loves a bunch of authors. My heart's broken several places. Baby's just sitting there reading about aces.